chat feature. So the chat feature can be found just looking for the word chat under the images as you move your mouse onto the video screen. And so you can write your questions down there in case you don't want to forget them before it's time for the discussion. And when we begin that section, she will begin by leading us with some of those questions, asking them so that we can begin to get some responses as you continue to think about other questions you might have. And you can also just ask your questions in the moment when we open up that time as well. Because we are recording this, I'm going to do the full presentation first, and then afterwards we will have the discussion. Reverend Marlene, can you also share about how people can access the recording after the presentation?
Yes. The recording of today's webinar will be posted on the TABCOM website, and it will also be posted in the TABCOM community that's on Ministry Life.
Thank you. So let us begin. I'm going to start by sharing my screen so that you can see my notes. And yes, beautiful. So one of the other things I'm going to do is move the video. All right, so I'm going to be speaking, as you have heard, on serving during hard times. First, I'd like to begin with an overview of the topics that I'm going to be covering. And my talk is going to be presented in 4 parts. First, the difficulty of hard times. What makes them so hard? Then the intersections of strain on those who lead. Sometimes we don't often realize that when we are facilitating any particular kind of project, leading an organization, especially when times get difficult, there become additional strains that we encounter. Then I want to shift to looking at hard times in relation to fear and trauma. And finally, bringing it home by talking about finding the way and ultimately serving during hard times. So the difficulty of hard times. First, all hard times generally are marked by similar themes. I'm going to give the themes first, and then I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper on the bookend themes that I identified. The 3 themes that I want to first speak about are that many needs emerge simultaneously when we experience a difficult season, especially if there's a sudden onset. The more sudden the onset, the steeper the curve in terms of how many needs start emerging at once. Also, resources for emerging needs may be in short supply. And third, some populations may be more affected than others. So what does that look like when we go a little bit deeper into the emerging needs? First, we have to realize that the changing circumstances have placed strains on information. We don't always have adequate information, or the flow of that information might be slow, the accuracy of it might be in question, and sometimes we may have issues with accessibility of that information as well. There can also be concerns around finances, because needs often require going hand in hand with the expectation of supplies to meet those needs. And the increase of having to get supplies will also mean an increase of funding sources needed to address that particular concern. And that might become an issue. Also, we find that everyone is experiencing increasing anxieties. People may be anxious about what they think could be going on. They might be anxious about what actually is going on. We may also, in some ways, not feel equipped to deal with the situation at hand and the emerging needs. And time becomes a concern. When you have a lot of needs emerging simultaneously, it means that you've got to start figuring out how to take care of a lot of things. Some may be more important than others, but all of them, because they're pressing in, may put a press on how much time you have to figure out addressing those resources. The other thing I wanted to press in on a little bit is that of the fact that some populations may be more affected than others, possibly due to poor or being marginalized within the community. Often the poor and the marginalized are often more affected. You can also find that those with health challenges may be more affected. They may not be able to move as readily if movement is required. They may not be as able to rebound if they're affected by whatever. And so in the situation of COVID-19, what we're finding is that people with health challenges are more vulnerable to succumbing to the infection once they become infected. You also find that people who gather in particular locations may also be more vulnerable. And again, this is one of the things that I'm highlighting in relation to general themes about hard times. And those locations can be, as with COVID-19, churches, but they can also be jails. They can be places where we work. The fact that when it comes to this particular situation, it's about being gathered in an enclosed space. However, depending on whatever is going on in the community, it can also be people who live in certain areas. For instance, those that were in New Orleans around the time of Hurricane Katrina. Hard times can also have an individual impact on all of us. As members of the broader community, we hurt when others hurt. We are also subsets of the larger population. So some of us may be members of the more vulnerable groups, and that can increase our sense of anxiety, the concerns that we have, the fears that we may be experiencing. And when you're also servant leaders, that can increase the fact that you have to work in a storm. When servant leaders are serving in storms, the different strains that they experience begin to intersect. And borrowing from the theories around intersecting issues around racism and femininity, etc., what I would like to mention is that when different strains intersect, it's not just additive, it can multiply. So one issue might create a certain level of strain for you, but experiencing two, perhaps you are now struggling with leading in terms of the needs that have emerged, but you're also personally affected. And the personal impact can be multi-layered, whether it is you yourself from your own health issues, it might be family concerns that emerge, but it can also be what's going on in the broader community, especially if you are serving an organization that reaches out to the broader community. As things change, you're struggling with, do I have the knowledge that I need to take care of this? What is going to happen tomorrow? What happens next? So we're trying to manage our own insecurities and our own uncertainties about what comes next. And the contexts are unstable. So there are a lot of things going on, and we don't know what tomorrow will look like, what next week will look like. So when you have one of these, there is a certain impact. But then you're taking a look at all of these starting to intersect and converge. And where they do, our sense of strain may actually increase exponentially. What does this look like when fear and trauma begin to step into the picture? And where does fear and trauma step in? Let's start first with the case of fear. Hard times make us feel vulnerable. That is just what it is. Whatever words we want to use to describe how we're feeling, we can say we're feeling fear, or we're being fearful, we're afraid, anxious, insecure, uncertain, or we may be distressed. Some of these words may simply represent different degrees or levels of intensity in how we're feeling, but whatever words that we use, they're not always easy to categorize. This particular slide shows some subsections of emotion wheels. And one of the things that I can show you is that under the section of fear on the clear black and white image, we see humiliated as one of the emotions that show up, and feeling disrespected. But on a different emotion wheel, we see these very words that categorize and describe emotions of fear in one wheel are categorized to describe emotions of embarrassment on another wheel. So the words, one person might use a particular word one way, and another might say, well, that's not how I describe what I'm experiencing. I have a different word. Whatever word we end up using for the intensity, for the name of the emotion, all of it is ultimately describing that we're feeling unsafe. When we feel unsafe, whether it's emotionally or physically, whether it is perceived, we think something is going on, but it might not actually be going on, or whether it is actual, there really is something that I need to pay attention to. Certain internal responses become triggered. Now, what I'm showing you is an image of what happens internally when our body gets triggered. Specifically, I'm going to point out to you the sympathetic nervous system for what happens when we're triggered. When we feel unsafe, it sends a signal of danger, danger to the brain. So years ago, there was this science fiction show where the robot would say when something was happening, danger, danger, Will Robinson, danger. And so we have something within our brains, and that is the amygdala. And the amygdala, if you take a look at the image of the brain to the right side of the screen, or to one side of your screen, you're seeing that the amygdala is actually a very small section on the inside of the brain, but it triggers such a large set of responses that happen in our body. So the message goes to the brain that says, we're not feeling safe. Immediately, a number of things start to happen in the body. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize with this is that what happens once this signal is sent to the brain is involuntary. This is an automatic process. And I repeat again that this is something we do not have control over. Why is that important to know? We live in a society that often says we need to be expert on whatever the situation is that we are placed in charge of. We need to always have circumstances under our thumbs so that we know everything that's going on everywhere at all times. This is a broad, vague expectation that exists within the society, but it is unreasonable. And it is not something, when we are experiencing any form of threat, that we can always control. There is a way back from it, but it requires really paying attention to the fact that okay, you know what? I'm feeling triggered. I'm starting to feel anxious. Let me start to soothe myself. However, I'm going to return to that part of the discussion shortly. I want to first continue discussing what happens when you are noticing that the brain has, not the brain, but the body has been pushed into another space. So I'm trying to highlight um, everything that's happening on this side of your screen. And I'm not going to do more marks than that because I don't want the entire screen to be unreadable. But let's see if we can do a spotlight instead. So you're seeing everything that I'm talking about on this side of the screen, where the sympathetic nerves have been activated. Now, the sympathetic nervous system takes care of the fight or flight responses. When that set of responses is triggered, hormones are released as a result of the amygdala being triggered. Those hormones will cause our mouth to go dry. It will cause our heart rate to increase. Our digestive system begins to shut down. It will also cause our bladder to relax, and that's why it can be easier when we're afraid to wet ourselves. So it's not something that an individual may have control over. And again, I want to emphasize the involuntary nature of what happens when this aspect of our nervous system is triggered because we're feeling unsafe. When our digestive system shuts down, it triggers what we have described frequently as being butterflies in our stomach. It also, one of the things that also occurs is that energy hormones are released. This happens so that if we need to fight, we can fight. But if we need to flee, we can get out of Dodge. Now, initially, the thinking centers of the brain are still functioning. That allows you to be able to assess what is going on in the situation. Is this really something that can be harmful, or am I really safe and it was just a misperception? Once the brain does that assessment, again, whether it is perceived or real, if the conclusion is that there is some danger, I am feeling unsafe, then what happens is the brain continues its process of fight or flight. These hormones that have been released to allow you to do one or the other, they can take over. Your body is prepared, it's tensed up, it's ready for what comes next so that we can either defend ourselves or get to places of safety. But during that process, it can also shut down our thinking centers. So it's harder to focus. It's more difficult to figure and think through problems that we're experiencing. And as a result, we will be more irritable because we're not able to think through a situation, or we just might not be able to understand or figure out what can be the best solution through a situation. So those are some of the things that occur when we are experiencing the fight or flight response that gets triggered by the brain from our sense of feeling unsafe. So that's the sequence of events. It doesn't matter what words we use. It's describing how we're feeling. And if we're not feeling okay, the brain starts to respond, and that is automatic. So when you notice it's more difficult to concentrate when you are experiencing a stressful time or a difficult season, it's not your imagination. There is actually a biological component that is validating your perception of being unable to function as well as you did when times were easier. So that's something really important I wanted to share with all of you. But then once you get past thinking, okay, so this is what's going on with my body, what about trauma? How does trauma factor in? Well, let me start with a simple definition of trauma. It is really an individual person's response to a situation that is distressing enough to overwhelm their ability to cope. This is not something that everyone experiences. Two people might be in a car crash, and one person walks away with a series of bruises that need to be addressed. Another person walks away not just with the physical impact, but also with an emotional response. They may experience nightmares, they may experience flashbacks, they may experience times when they just start fading out. This is part of post-traumatic stress. And we can experience this from time to time when we have a series of events that begin to stress our ability to cope. However, even though hard times can be intense, we can eventually find ways to shift towards being able to take care of ourselves. Some do shift towards being traumatized, and those who do might need some additional help. But those who are able to shift out of it will find that they do not have the same kind of results as someone who has experienced post-traumatic stress. It really depends on the person. And so don't automatically believe that the responses that you're experiencing are because you might be having post-traumatic stress. So I'm going to show you some things. Different experiences that can overwhelm our ability to cope, as with what's currently going on with COVID-19, include experiencing layers and waves of grief. So if we take a look at the side of our screen where that's described, layers and waves of grief, what we're seeing is that grief upon grief for any given situation can be experienced. For instance, if a loved one is in the hospital and we know that they're ill, that they're dying, we might not be allowed to be present with them as they transition from this life to the next. So that is a grief. Then, because of the current situations, we're not able to say goodbye the way that we would have at other times. That adds to the grief. And then if others aren't able to join us or we are not physically able to be present, that's a third layer. So that's one example of layer upon layer of grief. When hurts regarding who hurts are experienced regarding who gets to attend services or who doesn't get to attend services, if you're the leader, that can be difficult, and that's a layer of grief. And then there are those that might be too vulnerable to attend church even when it begins to reopen. They're experiencing a layer of grief. So those are some examples of what layer upon layer and waves of grief can look like. But there is also ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is something that's less tangible. Knowing that you can't physically be at a funeral, that is a tangible loss. You know what the situation is. But what happens if you're a leader and you've lost a cherished member, but you're not able to mourn in the same way that you would have otherwise because of the limitations created by COVID? That creates a sense of loss, and it's harder to put a finger on. So as a result, it becomes this loss that you're feeling, but you're not quite sure how to deal with. the shifting expectations of your role, especially if you're a servant leader. And in these times, you're now being expected to navigate becoming electronics experts so that you can run your services online. That shifts your role in ways that you didn't expect before, and that can create an ambiguous sense of loss. It may be that you're realizing the church is no longer the centralizing place of comfort. How do we navigate that when the sources of comfort now become diffused? We're not able to congregate in the way that we did before. We don't know how long this season will last. And yes, though there have been dictates identified that the church can open, the church really cannot open until appropriate protocols are in place to protect their members. And then we're talking about a phased in process. So there's a lot that needs to be figured out. There is a lot that feels vague and yet to be determined. And that puts a strain on the person trying to coordinate and facilitate this process. And the uncertainty that you might feel as a result of all of that, again, triggers a sense of loss that is hard to put your finger on. Having to make decisions about who can attend church and when they can attend church. It means that some people are getting left out, and that's another ambiguous loss. So there are different ways that we're having experiences that are overwhelming our ability to cope. There are other experiences as well, such as the constantly repeating news cycles. Those are giving us information that can be very difficult to hear. And in some cases, it's giving us information that we may not be able to do anything about. So now we might also be getting a sense of hopelessness. And so that becomes a trigger in relation to everything else that we're experiencing that can cause us to feel unsafe. All of this and all of the needs that we're trying to address can ultimately shift us to places towards mental and emotional fatigue. Now, mental and emotional fatigue is not the same thing as post-traumatic stress. It does mean that the brain, the mind and the brain are shutting down in some way. I believe, and this is my personal opinion, that the shutting down is actually preventative. It's causing us to step out of the heart of the fray, to step back from it, so that it's a message to us to say, we really need to pay attention to the fact that we're feeling overwhelmed. We really need to step back and take a look at what's going on with ourselves and take care of our needs so that we can then be prepared to step back into the fray from a better place. Please note that sometimes what we think of as depression might actually be the body's response to things that are going on around us. Let me show a little bit about that. So on this slide, I've shown on one side symptoms of mental fatigue, and on the other side, symptoms of grief. And what I want you to notice is that some of the same symptoms are present. So there is a context that we really need to pay attention to when it comes to looking at and identifying what we're feeling, what we're experiencing. When we are subject to mental fatigue, some of those symptoms can be depression, anxiety. We might feel pessimistic, detached. We might feel apathy or angry, hopeless, or have difficulty concentrating. But when you're grieving, a lot of those emotions and states are also in play. Depression, anxiety, feelings of anger, maybe not feeling apathetic, but there might be a certain lethargy or lack of energy. a sense of hopelessness, and difficulty concentrating. So pay attention to the context that might be contributing to what you're feeling, and recognize that what you think might be one thing might actually be a result of something else. So with all of this, what do we do then to try and find our way through so that we can return to serving in hard times? It's going to be important to recognize that situations that are difficult at any given point eventually change. And so we can also eventually shift out of those activated places where we've been triggered into fight or flight mode when the threatening situation passes. However, we can also begin to intentionally calm ourselves, and that will allow us to think again. And so I'm going to be sharing some things about how we can calm ourselves, but I want to give some strategies that we need to keep in mind. We must intentionally increase our self-soothing and relaxation activities, such as deep breathing. Deep breathing is one of the best ways to begin to calm ourselves when we have been activated and are starting to feel anxious. One of the ways that you can make sure you're taking a good deep breath is by placing your hand on your abdomen and feeling it expand as you breathe. Usually, we tend to think of, and I'm leaning forward so that you can see my hand is higher on my chest area. We think that when we're breathing and our chest is rising and falling, that we're taking deep breaths. But in actuality, our diaphragm is in the middle part of our body, underneath our stomach area. And as our diaphragm expands downward, our lungs open up. And that's when we're getting the oxygen we need that allows our body to begin to shift from places of anxiety to places of relaxation and to allow us to calm down. Another strategy that I will share a little bit later on is the butterfly hug. And I think you're going to enjoy that when I share it. But also, we should be finding ways to create more of those peace, be still moments. We know that Jesus calmed the storm by saying, "Peace, be still." I think of it as a way of just stepping out of the fray. We might go into our prayer closet. We might literally just go into a closet to step out of all of the activity going on around us. But whatever the storm might be, it's got to be an intentional decision to take a moment to step out of it. Also, when we are experiencing difficult times, it's harder to be with God. We need to actually intentionally make extra time to be with God, because we're not just talking about ourselves anymore. We're talking to God about what's going on around us. We're asking for wisdom. We're speaking on behalf of others that have emerged more than the usual group that we might be praying for or the occasional needs that have arisen. We're now looking at praying about more needs, a great increase of needs that has arisen. And that requires us to make extra time to be with God. But we also need to be with family and friends. Why is that important? Family and friends are part of our support network. If we don't, as I like to say, make deposits into those emotional banks, then when the time comes for us to make withdrawals, when we need the support, we're not going to be able to find that because we might be trying to pull from a deserted place. So take the time, nourish your relationships, because when you need those supports, they will then be there for you. Exercise is being identified continually as a wonderful way to help the body to shed and release stress. But also make sure that You're taking time to grieve the tangible losses and ask God to help with the sense of uncertain, ambiguous losses. What are the tasks of mourning when you're trying to figure out your way through? Well, it's important to accept the reality of the loss. Something has changed. If you're not sure what it is, pray and sit with the Lord. Take the time because you need it to help you understand what has changed and how you can best adjust to that change. Process the pain. With any change, with any loss, it is both necessary and unavoidable. Adjust to what life now looks like as a result of the change, without who used to be there, without things that used to be there. Life is different. Pay attention to those differences, acknowledge them, and adjust accordingly. Make room for remembrances. There's nothing wrong with that. When it comes to grief and loss, the two longest periods of mourning can be loss of a parent and loss of a child. We're talking about periods that can go beyond 5 years as the person is working through what this loss means and going through these particular stages. Loss and mourning aren't grieved in just a few days or 6 months or even a year. For some situations, for some kinds of losses, it can be years. And so we need to be kind to ourselves and recognize that time is a factor in any process of mourning. Also, see now, I want you all to consider lament. I'm speaking with a group of people who are leaders in their churches, as pastors, or in different contexts. Sometimes, and depending on the church community or the ethnic community, there is a belief that, well, I won't complain. In the Black church, there's even a song about it. But in reality, we need to be able to take our hurts, our hearts to God, our pain. We need to be able to release it there. And so we do this, but we should also teach others to do this and help them understand biblical lament. The lament process, ultimately, it begins with sorrow and it ends with hope. I've given some examples of corporate lament psalms that can be used to help a group of people deal with a loss and change that they're experiencing. And I've also given some when it's just you and God, so that you can then have the psalm as a guide for the corporate process or for the personal process. A general structure for the lament is you start by telling God what's wrong. Just complain if you need to yell. God can handle it. That's why God is God. Then ask, Lord, I would really appreciate if you could, and say what is on your heart. The fact that even though it feels like a complaint, because you're taking it to God, that in itself is an act of faith. And so take it to God. Ask what you need to ask. And as you release what needs to be released, that creates space, often, for hope to return. But there are times when the heaviness remains. Those times might just be times of lamentation. A lamentation, it starts and it ends frequently with the same kind of sorrowful sentiment. Lord, I'm just having a hard time. I need you to know that. There are occasions where we just don't get to let it all out in that particular time that we've got with the Lord. So we may not in that moment or in that session be able to release all of the heaviness that we're feeling. That's okay. That's biblical too. It's called a lamentation. And when we don't know what to do, we can trust that the Spirit will groan and will connect to God on our behalf. The whole process is trust and trusting that God is present and that He hears. So as we are continuing to find our way and we are trying to serve in hard times, what does that then look like? The best way is to continue making sure that we keep priorities in order. What are those priorities? We need to make sure that we are building right relationships with God. We need to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. And we can call that the airplane principle. When you're on the airplane and they're giving you the expectations for what to do in case of an emergency, they tell you to put on your own mask first before helping someone else. Why do they tell you this? Well, if you try to help someone else and become incapacitated in the process, you will no longer be able to help the next person. And you may also become a burden on the person you try to help. So as you take care of yourself, you are then able to take care of others. Make sure that you're also taking care of, in your list of priorities, your family. As you take care of yourself, that creates within you space to be able to take care of your family. We all need to remember and hold on to the realization Jesus took time to get away from the crowds and take care of himself, to be with himself and God, also to be with friends. And we can do no less. Here now endeth the lesson. Thank you for being with me during this time. And I'm going to now shift towards our discussion session. And at this point, the recording will be stopped.